September 22nd, 1985, the Plaza Hotel, New York City. 5 men walk into a room overlooking Central Park. The finance ministers of America, Japan, West Germany, France, and Britain. They are about to sign a single document that will destroy the most feared economy on Earth without firing a shot. Japan, in 1985, is unstoppable. Japanese companies own Rockefeller Center. Japanese investors are buying Pebble Beach, Columbia Pictures, half of downtown Los Angeles. Japan holds more American debt than any nation on the planet. Economists are writing books with titles like Japan as #1. The American century, they say, is ending. The Japanese century is beginning. Within 10 years, Japan will have lost everything. Not to a war, not to a disaster, to the documents signed in this room. 5 signatures that doubled the value of the yen in 18 months and triggered the asset bubble that would destroy the Japanese economy for the next 35 years. A bubble Japan is still recovering from today. I've spent months studying exactly what happened at the Plaza Hotel, the mechanism, the trap, the precise way America used its financial power to dismantle a rival without a single act of aggression. And here is what stopped me cold. China holds $800 billion in US Treasury bonds. In 2013, it held $1.3 trillion. That's $500 billion sold, quietly, deliberately, methodically, over the past decade. China watched exactly what America did to Japan in 1985, and China has spent the last 10 years making absolutely certain it never happens to them. Stay with me. Here is what most people get wrong about the Plaza Accord. They treat it as a technical currency agreement, a boring footnote in economic history, something about exchange rates that only matters to specialists. And that framing is exactly why almost nobody understands what actually happened or why it matters so urgently right now. Because the Plaza Accord was not a currency agreement, it was a weapon, the most elegant financial weapon ever deployed by one nation against another. And to understand how it worked, you first need to understand why Japan had become a target. After World War II, Japan rebuilt itself on a single model: export manufacturing. Japanese companies made products, cars, televisions, semiconductors at extraordinary quality and remarkably low prices. They sold those products to American consumers, and they accumulated the resulting profits as dollar reserves: Toyota, Sony, Honda, Panasonic. Japanese brands systematically dismantled their American competitors in industry after industry. By 1985, Japan was running a $50 billion annual trade surplus with the United States. American factories were closing. American workers were losing their jobs to Japanese competition. And in Washington, the political pressure to do something about Japan had become impossible to ignore. The Reagan administration faced a choice. It could impose tariffs, but that would trigger retaliation and violate trade agreements. It could restrict Japanese imports directly, but that would spark a trade war. Or it could do something far more subtle, something that would look like international cooperation while functioning as economic warfare. It called a meeting. Here is the critical part, the mechanism that made the Plaza Accord so devastating. The 5 nations agreed to intervene in currency markets to deliberately weaken the US dollar against the Japanese yen and the German mark. Central banks would sell dollars and buy yen. The stated rationale was to reduce America's trade deficit by making American exports cheaper and Japanese imports more expensive. On paper, it sounded reasonable, technical, cooperative. The consequences for Japan were catastrophic. Before the Plaza Accord, $1 US bought 240 Japanese yen. By 1987, thus, less than 2 years later, $1 bought just 120 yen. The yen had doubled in value in 18 months. And for an economy built entirely on exports, this was an extinction-level event. Think about what this meant. A Toyota that sold in America for $10,000 in 1985 now cost the equivalent of $20,000. Not because Toyota raised its price, but because the currency had moved underneath it. Japanese exports became dramatically more expensive overnight. The trade surplus that had driven Japanese growth for decades began to shrink. Japanese manufacturers faced an impossible choice: absorb massive losses, raise prices, and lose market share, or move production overseas. And here is where the trap closed. The Japanese government panicked. To offset the export slowdown caused by the soaring yen, the Bank of Japan slashed interest rates aggressively, flooding the economy with cheap money. And that cheap money did not flow into productive investment. It flowed into speculation. Land prices in Tokyo rose so fast that, at the peak, the grounds of the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo were theoretically worth more than all the real estate in the entire state of California. The Nikkei stock index tripled between 1985 and Japanese companies borrowed against these inflated assets to buy more assets, including Rockefeller Center, Columbia Pictures, and Pebble Beach. These were not irrational purchases. They were the logical consequence of a currency that had been artificially doubled by a hotel meeting in New York. Then, in 1989, the Bank of Japan, alarmed by the monster bubble it had created, began raising interest rates, 5 hikes in 12 months. The cheap money that had inflated the bubble was withdrawn, and the bubble did what all bubbles do, it collapsed. The Nikkei fell 60% in 3 years. Japanese land prices fell 70% and never recovered. Banks that had lent against inflated collateral suddenly held trillions in worthless loans. Japan's financial system was insolvent, and then Japan made the decision that locked in 35 years of stagnation. Rather than forcing the bad loans into the open, restructuring the banks, and accepting a sharp, painful recession, Japan chose slow suffocation. Zombie banks kept alive by government support. Zombie companies kept alive by zombie banks. Interest rates held near zero for decades to prevent the debt from crushing the economy. Japan is still waiting. The Nikkei only surpassed its 1989 peak in 2024, 35 years later. An entire generation of Japanese workers entered the workforce into stagnation and never experienced the growth their parents had. Now, here is why China's treasury selling is not just a financial story, it is a strategic one. China began accumulating US Treasury bonds for exactly the same reason Japan did. It ran massive trade surpluses with America. It received dollars, and it recycled those dollars into the safest dollar-denominated asset available, US government debt. At its peak in 2013, China held $1.3 trillion in American treasuries. China was Japan in 1985, America's largest foreign creditor. But China had something Japan did not have. China had Japan's example. Chinese policymakers have studied the Plaza Accord with extraordinary care, and the lesson they drew was precise and permanent. Never allow America to control the terms of your currency. Never hold so much American debt that your financial stability depends on Washington's goodwill. Never let your economy become so intertwined with the dollar system that American financial pressure becomes existential. This is why China has been selling treasuries for a decade. Not in a panic, not in a crisis. Deliberately, methodically, $500 billion reduced from $1.3 trillion down to $800 billion. China is not trying to crash the dollar. That would destroy the value of its own remaining holdings and devastate its export markets simultaneously. China is reducing its exposure, diversifying into gold, buying at record levels, over 1,000 tons added in recent years, building bilateral trade relationships settled in yuan rather than dollars. The mechanism is the exact inverse of Japan's trap. Japan held dollars and got squeezed. China is reducing its dollar exposure before the squeeze can arrive. And here is the question America now faces. What happens when the selling accelerates? And what happens when other large holders of American debt draw the same conclusion China did? Japan currently holds $1.1 trillion in US treasuries, even more than China. And after 35 years of stagnation, Japan is finally experiencing inflation again. The Bank of Japan is slowly, carefully raising interest rates. And as Japanese rates rise, Japanese investors have an increasingly attractive domestic alternative to American government bonds. The yield gap that made US debt attractive is narrowing. If Japan begins selling in earnest, its selling would dwarf China's. Now here is the arithmetic that makes this genuinely dangerous. America needs to sell approximately $2 trillion in new treasury bonds every single year to finance its deficit and to refinance maturing old debt. Foreign buyers have historically absorbed a significant portion of that issuance. But if the two largest foreign holders simultaneously reduce their exposure, the buyers who remain must be compensated with higher yields. Higher yields mean higher interest rates across the entire American economy. Higher mortgage rates, higher corporate borrowing costs, slower growth, and most critically, higher interest payments on the $36 trillion national debt itself. America already pays over $1 trillion per year in interest on its debt. 10 years ago, that figure was $350 billion. If rates rise further because foreign demand weakens, that interest burden rises further. The more it rises, the more America must borrow to cover it. The more it borrows, the more treasuries it must sell. The more it must sell, the more it needs foreign buyers. The more it needs foreign buyers, the more vulnerable it becomes to their decisions. This is the spiral. And China understands it perfectly because China has been quietly stepping out of it for 10 years. Japan didn't choose its fate in 1985. 5 finance ministers chose it in a hotel room in New York. Japan held $200 billion in American debt and had no exit. It thought its relationship with America was a partnership. It was in right up until American domestic politics turned Japan into a target. The Plaza Accord was legal, coordinated, and utterly devastating. And Japan never saw it coming until the signatures were already on the paper. China is making absolutely certain it sees it coming. The $500 billion it has already sold is the evidence. The question is no longer whether China's selling matters. The question is whether America's $36 trillion debt still gives it the same leverage over China that it once had over Japan, or whether China has already moved far enough toward the exit that the leverage is gone. Because Japan thought its American debt made it powerful. It turned out to be a leash. And China has spent a decade quietly cutting it before America ever gets the chance to pull. Subscribe if you want to keep following this, because I'm tracking the exact financial mechanisms connecting what America did to Japan in 1985 to what China is doing to America right now. And I want your argument in the comments. Japan held $200 billion and had no exit. China holds $800 billion and has spent 10 years building one. Can China truly escape the dollar trap that destroyed Japan, or is $800 billion still enough for America to run the same playbook one more time? Drop your answer below. The most compelling argument gets pinned.